Okay, and welcome everybody. My name is Susan Lerner. I'm the Director of Horticulture at the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach, and I am the caretaker and lover of Pan's Garden, Florida's first all-native botanical garden. And I reached out to Benjamin back in 2019 because I saw in him a like-minded native nerd activist and was excited to have him speak for us. And it's taken a little bit of time, but here we are today, and I'm really delighted to have to share him with you and hear what he has to say. So a little bit of introduction about Benjamin. He is an author and ecological landscape designer. He has a Ph.D. in creative writing from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and owns Monarch Gardens, LLC, a prairie garden design company in eastern Nebraska. He speaks nationally on garden design and landscape ethics at conferences and seminars, and for over 5 years wrote an award-winning native plant column at House, which garnered over 3 million readers. That's a lot of readers. Benjamin is the author of the books A New Garden Ethic, Cultivating Defiant Compassion for an Uncertain Future, and the forthcoming Prairie Up, an introduction to nature-based garden design. It'll be out later this year. And you can get a signed copy from his website, or you can find them on Amazon, although they're back-ordered at the moment on Amazon. There's a big demand for what we're all talking about today. So without further ado, let me invite Benjamin to introduce his screen, and let's get started.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, let's get started. There she goes. It's a pleasure to meet with you all here today. You might be a fuzz bit warmer where you are than where I am, but we just got an inch of snow last night, which I am so excited about. We need any kind of moisture that we can possibly get out here in the dry plains. So again, thank you for having me. I'm sure everybody is totally into the news right now, but what you maybe would have missed in the news on page 10 is that corduroy pillows are making headlines. This is the part where everybody laughs quietly in their own offices and homes. Oh, you know, elevator jokes are the best. They work on so many levels. All right, now that we're warmed up, we're going to get into a very serious talk today. So hopefully you have your thinking caps on. There's going to be a lot of, certainly a lot of deep thoughts. There's going to be, I'm going to give you a little bit of a trigger warning too, because there's going to be some emotional things in here. So just be aware. So one day I was on my garden, on my hands and knees, where we should all be more often, I think, because there's all kinds of cool things going on at the ground layer, under all the plants, all that good stuff that's going on there. And I heard behind me this rustling sound and turned around, and there was this female black swallowtail butterfly. You can see she was at the end of her life. She's had a lot of bits and pieces taken out of her by birds, but she was never eaten. I helped her lay the last 5 eggs of her life, and 3 of them actually hatched. So what happened to everybody, I don't know. We were friends for only a small amount of time, but I think for all of us, this is one of the major reasons why we garden. It's not just a space for us, but it's a space for other creatures. If not equally, then maybe even more so than equally. Maybe we garden 75, 80% for other species and welcoming nature home into our lives and back into our altered urban environments. So here's a quote. A lot of you will probably recognize this. This is going to be one of our main guiding lights here over the next 45 minutes or so. It starts, the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals are collectively the land. And that land as a community is a basic concept of ecology, but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. A land ethic then reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, and this in turn reflects a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of land. A land ethic implies respect for our fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So if you have not read Aldo Leopold's book, Sand County Almanac, you should run out and get that immediately after the talk, after you get whatever books I may have floating around out there in the world. So that's our guiding light for today, but also we need to be thinking about these different ways of looking at landscapes, these three landscape perspectives. So we have something called ecocentrism, and that's stating that the ecosystem, living and non-living components matters above all else, which is a really radical idea because for a lot of people, it feels alienating because it's almost like othering humans, making us not the privileged species, but a species that is equal with others and even inanimate objects like mountains and rocks and rivers. Then we have another landscape perspective called biocentrism. That's all living things carry the same highest possible value on our planet. A very foreign concept, unfortunately, to a lot of cultures, especially Western cultures. And then we have the last one, which I have never been able to successfully pronounce. I probably need to go into Google and listen to it some more, so I'm not going to try. But it's a system we have now, right? Humans are valued above all else. And it's a very detrimental system as we face climate change and mass extinction. So again, the question is, as always, who are we gardening for? We are gardening for looper moths. They will, chew off little bits of petals from flowers and put them on their back so they blend in. In this case, this looper moth has recently come from probably an aster and is now on goldenrod, so needs to switch over. We are gardening for crab spiders. We are gardening for grass-carrying wasps and mason bees that make their homes in 6-inch pieces of Joe Pye weed that you've cut and put horizontally on an arbor or a fence. We are gardening for monarch butterflies. We are gardening for mourning doves and their babies. Mourning doves make absolutely the stupidest nest I've ever seen of all bird species, I think, so far today. It's basically 4 little twigs, and they just say to their babies, yeah, just try and hold on for 2 weeks. If it gets stormy, I'll probably come back and feed you or something. That's what it looks like to me. We're gardening for tree frogs. We're gardening for hummingbirds. You're gardening for those days when you're packing to go on a trip and your wife yells at you from across the house to grab your camera because look at this cool thing. There's a robin drinking melting snow off the corner of the garden storage bench on the deck, but then a bluebird lands and another bluebird lands, and they all take turns drinking melting snow off of the corner of that garden storage bench. So let's talk about biophilia and with David Orr. He says the biophilia revolution must come as an ecological enlightenment that sweeps out the modern superstition that we are knowledgeable enough and good enough to manage the earth and to direct evolution. So biophilia is this idea that we have an innate or genetic predisposition to sync meaningful connections with nature and other species around us. Now, what we need is a revolution of authentic connection with daily wildness. If we are going to have any faith in humanity or our ability to care for all species together and equally. Because what it comes down to in our gardens is plants are not art. What we do with them, how we honor their life processes as part of creating ecological function, now that's art. And that means that gardens are now the negotiation between our species and the living world. It also means that gardens have a deeply ethical component that we can't ignore in a time of mass extinction. So nature is not here to look beautiful for us. It is here to give us our lives and the lives of all those we depend upon. Nature's beauty is the ego we leave behind us when we learn the language of forest, prairie, river, ocean, desert, bog, and even fen. We live in a horticulture world where new products are prized like the latest cell phones or pair of shoes. But plants aren't just objects for one species to visually consume. We introduce new plants bred for our delight without fully understanding them as complex individual organisms or their role in an ecosystem, whether the ecosystem is 100% human-contrived garden or a wilder area just beyond the fence or even something between the two. Until we start understanding what value or even rights plants have as their own living beings and as hubs for other life forms, the plant industry will never truly be green in the way we suppose it to be. Or to put it another way, if climate change and mass extinction aren't the first subjects we're addressing in horticulture, then perhaps horticulture is not as powerful or relevant as we assume. So there are basically two environmental philosophies at play in our discussion here today. The first is something called deep ecology. It wants to revamp human systems that deny cultural and biodiversity in nature, recognizing that human culture is not the only or even primary culture on the planet. So stop for a second and ask yourselves, well, what is the culture of an aster, of a milkweed, of a mining bee, or even of a stone? Because they do have cultures. The other environmental philosophy is something called shallow ecology. It promotes technological fixes to address environmental issues, often using the same methods as a consumptive, industrial-based society that eroded nature. So the question then is, how can horticulture make positive changes to our environment when it's part of the system that's eroding nature? There's this sinister mix of shallow ecology and deep ecology at play in horticulture. Now, the main difference between these two philosophies is that deep ecology regards all species as having essential wisdom to guide us forward, whereas shallow ecology primarily looks to humans for understanding and direction. Plants are part of a culture separate from our own. They release scents to attract or warn off predators or to communicate with one another. They become more or less aggressive depending on who they want to help. Their flowers are adorned with UV runway lights and markings to signal nectar availability to pollinators, while also creating positive or negative atmospheric charges for the same purpose. Nature is incredibly organized and doesn't need us, but we insist on making gardens as a way to consciously or unconsciously control or provide ourselves a sense of order in a world we find wild, chaotic, unpredictable, perhaps even dangerous. So in other words, our emotions frame what we do in nature. So how can gardens revive compassion, equality, and freedom among all species? How do we practice deep ecology and biocentrism? To know where we're going, we have to know where we've been, why we think and act the way we do. And it can be really personal and quite unnerving. For example, my mother grew up with an abusive stepfather. As I gardened with my mother as a child, I never understood why she spent so much time outside. I suppose I just assumed it's what mothers did, perhaps as a way to get a breath of fresh air from the duties of family and running a small business. She'd make the family come outside on a Saturday afternoon to help clean up trimmings or move plants. I both volunteered and was coaxed into nursery trips where I slowly fell in love with the rich, damp forest of perennials and annuals rising like tunnel walls on both sides of our meandering stroll. Where did my mother's passion for gardening come from? It wasn't until I started writing a book in my late 20s about growing up gardening and finding nature partly through this labor that I started asking her some pretty tough questions. I remember sitting in my mom's office and finally pushing herself to a bridge she never wanted to cross. She told me this would be the only time she'd speak with me about it. How her stepfather treated her and her siblings, how he beat the boys, how he drugged her with a milkshake, then with her half passed out, tried and for some reason failed to assault her. How visiting her grandparents' vegetable and flower gardens was both escape and healing as she sat in a tire swing beneath a weeping willow. But gardens weren't just an escape or a way to heal. The nature within them was a way to become empowered as she, the eldest child from a different father, became a second mother to her brothers and sisters. Now, guys, I'm not telling you these things because I want to, but because together we need to understand something pivotal from the outset. We carry our wounds into the natural world. Our joys and fears, angers and doubts are reflected outward. We deposit our emotions and culture in every river, mine, farm, park, and lawn, and in every plant we dig. We dictate to the planet more often than we listen or seek to understand, and we do this with each other too. This is why, for me, every garden and every plant matters. Every action we take outside of ourselves is a prayer for or against the community we are a part of. How do we garden in a time of mass extinction and climate change? In a time when we don't seek out the wisdom of plants and animals, but see ourselves as separate and worth more than everyone else? How can we let nature rebuild and revive us together? Well, I think one path lays through native plants. What's a native plant then? I always like to go with Doug and Rick's definition from their book. A plant that has evolved in a given place over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. We could say, I suppose, that a native plant is one that existed in the Americas before overwhelming and high-speed European colonization, but I think everybody has a different idea, especially argumentative folks who say, well, ginkgos were native here millions of years ago, and then, we just have to go and brawl outside behind the dumpsters, and that never ends well. And I know a lot of you know the benefits of native plants, but here are some of them. Native plants provide 15 to 35 times the caterpillar biomass versus exotics, and 96% of songbirds feed insects to their young. So plants produce bird food, right? Native bees visit native plants 4 times more. They support our nearly 4,000 native bee species that have longer flight times than honeybees, provide specific pollination like buzz, which increases fruit yield quality and shelf life. So if you're like my son and you like strawberries and blueberries and almonds, you're going to want to have as many native bees flying around as we can possibly get. Now, fortunately, honeybees outcompete native bees for resources. They have a larger flight range and higher numbers. That's just a numbers fact, right? And they do spread disease to other bees because of these high numbers. Honeybees are globally stable. They are a managed species and are an agricultural issue. Native bees are an ecological issue. And I say this, I put this slide in here because I worry a lot about urban honeybee raising and farming. Now, losing one specialist native bee species sends the entire pollinator system out of whack as other specialists are forced to become generalists as they take over. Now, when we have more native plants, we get more native pollinators, and in turn, we have more seed production and more adaptable plants that are going to be able to face climate change, hopefully. But native plants are really the tip of a much, much larger iceberg, and they certainly represent more than aesthetic value. And maybe that's the problem too, because talking about gardens is not just a refuge from trouble, but the heart of trouble, a reflection of larger social issues we can change, is uncomfortable, and maybe it should be uncomfortable. We don't want our gardens to be statements for anything but personal pleasure. We don't want our gardens to be influenced by the world out there. Gardens are supposed to be monastic sanctuaries away from conflict or critical thought or even activism. But our gardens are not insular little worlds. Our gardens and managed landscapes are not just for us. To assume they are is racism towards other species. Now, one myth of a garden is that it rights systemic cultural wrongs, such as human supremacy or capitalism or deforestation or whatever. That we help the environment get in tune with nature and inherently practice sustainability simply by using plants. Another myth of the garden is that any composition of plants is better than no garden at all. That it really doesn't matter if you use a large proportion of natives as long as the plants you use are fitted to the soil, light, and climatic conditions. But we need to realize something. We are colonizers, and as such, we replace the culture of the oppressed with the culture of the oppressor, whether that's through our plant choices or in how we arrange those plants. Now, a garden can be a way to bridge our cultures, human and animal, human and plant, but it's also too often a way to exercise domination over others in the name of one's own joy, happiness, and sense of personal freedom. If this control is primarily what a garden is, then perhaps gardens will, in the end, always fail to move us into a better relationship with other species. Now, here is a picture of Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm sure you all just can't wait to come out here and visit me. These are 3-acre lots behind me on the edge of Lincoln, and you can see there on the left middle is where the Husker football team loses all of their football games, which gives me immense pleasure. I'm not a Husker fan. Now, a common idea is that native plants can't redeem wilderness, especially in urban areas, because such a wild place no longer exists. In other words, using a majority of native plants will not recreate, stabilize, or be of significant ecological benefit because the historical wildness or ecosystem no longer exists. You can't turn back the clock, the saying goes. Now, native plant garden design is not about turning the clock back or redeeming wilderness, but reviving it. While wilderness may not exist in the bucolically pristine way we idealize in art, the ecological interactions, and especially the species that depend on wildness and native plants are still very much here and critically important to our future, even if the original native landscape is gone forever. What does Aldo Leopold say about intelligent tinkering? He says, leave as many pieces as you can. Are we doing that? Often the line of argument goes that being a native plant purist makes the perfect the enemy of the good. The reasoning goes that having 100% native plant landscape is not only functionally unrealistic, but is also unfair to humans because it's limiting, constrictive, and otherwise undemocratic. In other words, a native plant garden reduces human freedom. None of these tenets are true unless we're gardening for just one species. If, on the other hand, our intent is to garden for the community, then native plants are not limiting, but in fact are life-giving and freedom-giving to countless seen and unseen fauna above and below the soil line. For me, then, the native plant conversation is not one of resistance or a hardline fundamentalist stance. Instead, the conversation is about stoking the embers of connectivity to the natural world while reimagining and recreating a human culture that values other cultures, plants and animals, as much as its own. Such empathy and compassion does not come easily to us, even among ourselves. How can we have compassion for other species, especially those we've been raised to fear? Our 4,000 native bee species are at great risk right now, particularly bumblebees who evolved in a cooler climate and those whose life cycles center around specific flowers. Within blooms is highly nutritious pollen which bees feed to their young. Now, one of the most beneficial groups of plants for bees and other pollinators is goldenrod, which from 1842 to 2014 has seen a reduction in pollen protein of 30%. Such loss is due to elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and will not only affect bee health, but also bee size, which in turn affects the bee's ability to successfully forage. As plants produce more carbohydrates in response to increased carbon in the air, essential nutrients like zinc, iron, vitamin A all become diluted, making plants less nutritious for humans and insects alike. Now, to adapt to climate change, species are going to need habitat corridors and islands of refuge, and that's certainly where we can benefit them in urban areas. Our smallest native bees have flight ranges of less than 3 blocks before they have to refuel on nectar. We've lost 1/10 of global wilderness in the last 20 years, and 50% of species face extinction by 2100. We may lose 30% of all plant species just by 2050. I made no guarantees at the beginning of this talk that this was going to be happy, but this will not be the last slide either, so be forewarned. Okay, so speaking of island of refuges, these island refuges and habitat corridors, I mean, just look at this map. This is a map of lawn-dominant urban areas. You can just see by squinting your eye the potential and the possibility we have to create corridors, especially for species that can fly. Some of these are a little bit long distance here. We have 63,000 square miles of lawn, which is equal to the size of Georgia, and 5,000 acres every day are converted to lawn. Amazon rainforest sees 10,000 acres converted per day. So we're at 50% of that, but my God, that's a huge number, right? Now, I want to tell you a little bit more about my home, or at least where I am living right now and where I'm coming from. And hopefully you'll see a reflection of yourself and your home places too, which can guide your garden making this spring and summer. So this is where I'm from, the Great Plains. This is a map that shows the original extent. There are lots of different maps. This is the one I always like to go with. So picture this in your mind. This is what was. We're thinking mostly, probably. This is what's been taken away, all the brown. So it's a major significant conversion, right? I mean, our biodiversity hotspots where we have the most species at risk of extinction, it's in the southeast and the southwest. You think looking at this map, it would be in the Midwest, but that's not so. Here's what's left of the Great Plains. Green is fairly intact habitat, and this is an old map. This is 17 years old, so it's certainly gotten worse. You can see the Flint Hills in eastern Kansas, the Sand Hills. We have I'll talk about that in a second. Now, my Mennonite family, German Mennonites who had previously settled in Ukraine, homesteaded the Oklahoma Prairie, which makes me a little conflicted. I honor their sacrifice coming from Germany and Russia in the 1870s, the poverty and agony, but I also have to acknowledge the prairie and Native American cultures they eroded to make their dreams come true. Surely there was a better way, a middle way, one of empathy and compassion and cross-cultural pollination that benefited everyone. Plants, animals, the Cheyenne and Arapaho and Kiowa peoples. Why can't we speak the language of others and in doing so see them as equals? Did you know prairie dogs have a really elaborate and specific and highly evolved language? There's a scientist, he was out in New Mexico, studied prairie dogs and found out that their language is so specific, they can say, here comes a tall human in a white shirt from the West carrying a rifle. And rifles are certainly not prairie dog friends. A lot of people like to use prairie dogs as target practice. But they're a keystone species. Healthy grasslands and prairies have prairie dogs in them. And we're not flyover country out here, we're fly into country. So sandhill cranes are coming through right now. Up to 500,000 are going to be here any day now. Come see them. We have Toadstool Geologic Park out west, which looks like a Star Wars film set. Maybe even more so here. Nebraska actually has as many ecoregions as does the entire US from the eastern Nebraska border all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. I can't believe I live in a place here where we have east and west, north and south meeting, intermingling, and even creating new species. We even have more river mileage than any other state, which we found out a couple of years ago when we had massive flooding. And we have Carhenge, not too much reason to visit. Maybe you can check out the gift shop. We didn't stay too long. I also come from a place where if you go far enough west, you can find empty blacktop, pull over, stop the engine, and hear absolute silence until the cows come home. The air is thick with life, even though you don't see or hear it. It's simply all around you, penetrating and absorbing like amniotic fluid. And perhaps this state of being is what we seek in our gardens but can rarely cultivate. Tallgrass prairie, so the eastern Great Plains is the most altered, least conserved ecosystem on the planet. We're probably actually under 1% now. We have 5,000 plant species native to the plains. Grassland nesting birds are the fastest declining group of birds in North America. I told you we were not done with depressing slides, but we have to know this stuff so we can get empowered to do something, right? Now, to respect life, I think you have to respect the place it comes from, the culture of its existence, and let it develop its culture of place. A prairie's culture, and we have prairies in every state, is one we barely understand, a complex structure formed over countless generations where mutualism and exclusion create healthy and resilient ecosystems above and below the soil line. In many human cultures, a prairie culture, the prairie ecosystem itself, would seem destructive and undemocratic. A prairie would be harsh, unrealistic, unfair, and totalitarian. And maybe that's why we've eradicated so much of it in America. We can do this, right? Find a prairie and hug the corn out of it. It's a big deal out here in Nebraska. We're corn central, right? But we also want to find a state capitol here in Lincoln and hug the lawn out of it. I learned a couple years ago that our state capitol, instead of lawn, was supposed to have prairie around it, restored prairie. And by the way, if you want to know the nickname of this building, well, we can talk afterwards, but you have to pry me with a couple of drinks first. You know what it is. And we need to find more suburban lots and hug the lawn out of them. Whatever fits your ecoregion, put the plants there, right? And here's a fall shot for you. I'm showing you pictures of headquarters where all the deep things happen. Oldest garden out back. And when we occasionally get winter, we don't get it as much as we used to. This looks scary to everybody south of me. All right, we're gonna get to the deep stuff. Are you all ready? So if you need to take a bathroom break or you just need to take a mental chill, you've got 5 seconds to do that, because this is the heart of the matter here, the heart of the issue today. Let's talk about psychology 101, something called ethical amnesia. Now, when we act unethically, we tend to remember those actions less clearly, a phenomenon based in the fact that we feel uncomfortable remembering ourselves acting in ways we shouldn't. That's ethical amnesia. It's driven by the desire to lower one's distress that comes from acting unethically and to maintain a positive self-image. So in general, people will limit the retrieval of memories that threaten their moral or ethical self-concept. This is one reason why scientific consensus is so often rejected, because the new reality threatens our belief systems and who we think we are. And when more evidence or fact is presented, a backfire event happens. people stand their ground even more staunchly to preserve their comforting worldview. I think what's going on is that we're avoiding grief, and in the garden world, we're avoiding environmental grief. This is the 5 stages of grief. This is the order that makes sense for me, but you can certainly reorder them how it works for you. Now, we avoid grief when we don't address climate change, or when we don't act critically engage with what our gardens are doing and what they should do in light of climate change and mass extinction. Here's Mary Pfeiffer from her book, The Green Boat. It's an environmental psychology book. If you haven't read it, pick it up, man. It's going to open up windows and doors for you. She says, we humans are programmed to respond to threats by fleeing or fighting. Our global storm will not let us do either. Our problems feel too big to fight, and there is no place we can flee to, so we feel paralyzed. We are in a crisis that is too scary to confront and too important to ignore. Willful ignorance occurs when it feels wrong to acknowledge and wrong not to acknowledge a situation. Now, one universal reality is that avoiding our emotions or minimizing them will prolong our grief. And this is something I see in the garden world quite clearly. We sidestep grief when we avoid confronting how gardens collectively and meaningfully impact the environment. We'll defend our plant and design choices to the last. So snowdrops, daffodil, forsythia, hosta, wood mulch galore. We will do anything we can to avoid looking more deeply and authentically at our culture so we don't have to face the loss, the grief, and the difficulty to change or be agents of change in a world crying out for compassion on a profound new level. Now, how do we avoid grief? What does it look like? We may deny reality or accept some aspect, but deny others. We'll minimize or normalize. Oh, that's not as big of a deal as you're saying that it is, or we'll overemphasize our lack of power, right? I'm just one person. Nobody's going to listen to me. And of course, killing the messenger. And that's where labels come in, like native plant purists and worse. Now, there are 3 landscape levels, particularly in urban and urban edge areas. The first is historical wild ecosystems that show no or little change. And those really don't exist anymore, right? We have so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Every last square inch of land and every last cubic inch of oceans has been changed in some way. Now, what we do have a lot of, especially in the US, is hybrid or mostly wild ecosystems which show reversible changes. We have lots of those. We're lucky here. We're not like a Great Britain where the changes are they've been so much longer and more extensive. And then we have novel ecosystems. They show irreversible changes with a radical difference from historical ecosystem structure, composition, and function, and an ongoing self-organization that's either human created or self-created. So think of a vacant, weedy lot in an urban area. There's lots of examples. I'm just throwing that one at you. They're more manicured as well, like the one on the right. So the idea of novel ecosystems actually helps us avoid grief, as well as avoiding the complications of ethical insight and critical thinking. They give us a way to keep exercising our privilege over other species as we select plants we want in our landscapes. Now, you remember that earlier critique about urban native plant gardens and that we can't redeem wilderness? That's a defense or coping mechanism to protect ourselves, both from too much reality and the hard, uncomfortable work of reconceptualizing what we believe to be true about ourselves as colonizers or as human supremacists. Here's Doug and Rick again. 85% of the Earth's ecosystems are now novel, containing species with no prior history of interaction and no evolutionary relationship. Such ecosystems are built, at least in part, from non-relational biodiversity. A linguist could successfully argue that without functional interactions, such collections of organisms do not constitute an ecosystem at all. That's a pretty startling quote. Might make a good tattoo for you. Now, speaking of novelty, this plant often creates a conversation that quickly gets heated. Why is that? What is this plant? Butterfly bush attracts only a few charismatic generalist long-tongued insects who can access the nectar. No North American insect has co-evolved with the pollen or the leaves, and the plant invades Appalachian roads, brick walls in England, and now some Midwestern grasslands. Yet people plant it in the belief it helps butterflies. And when it's suggested it might actually hurt butterflies, it feels like a condemnation or erasure of personal values. What we thought we knew was right turns out to be more complicated. And it changes the perception of ourselves as doing good and being ethical. But realizing that gardening carries good and bad consequences is liberating and, I think, empowering. We are practicing critical thinking when we don't take plants or garden design at face value. Butterfly bush doesn't help us deal with environmental grief. Instead, it helps us avoid grief by privileging a few adult butterflies over ecosystem function, and by privileging our desire for immediate visual gratification, aka flamboyant adult butterflies zooming around. Oh, let's look at Rick and Doug one more time. The relationship between landscaping practices and the production of vital ecosystem services has created ethical issues never before faced by gardeners. Because the resources and services that support all humans come from functional landscapes, and function starts with plants, the planting and management choices we make at home impact our neighbors and indeed our greater society as a whole. Unfortunately, this new reality is in direct conflict with Western culture's tradition of private land ownership. Now, again, native plants are the tip of a much, much, much larger iceberg. The conversation goes well beyond what is native and why or how gardens work. And the very fact that we keep having this conversation, writing seminars and podcasts, and that it makes some in horticulture uncomfortable is evidence that we need to be having even larger conversations about why we garden and who we garden for and what it means in a time of climate change and mass extinction. Our culture needs to be confronted in as many ways as possible for the sake of future humanity and non-human species. Part of that confrontation is to keep looking at plants and gardens from the perspective of other species. In novel urban ecosystems, we have to ask ourselves difficult questions. And they're difficult because, frankly, we need to be entomologists, horticulturists, ecologists, and even sociologists and psychologists all at once. So, for example, when we see bees using plants in our gardens, regardless of their origin, we may think the plants are beneficial and fulfilling a critical ecological role. And we default to this assumption because it confirms what we want to believe. But as is often the case, the situation may be more complicated, which can lead to a beautiful process of discovery. If we just look at bee-plant interactions, some of the deeper questions can include, is it a bee, fly, or wasp because mimics abound in nature? Is the bee species native to the region, or did it maybe evolve with the plant it's using, or is it a generalist? What is that bee's life cycle, preferred habitat, and range? What plants are blooming concurrently? What is the relative bloom abundance of those plant species, and which flowers is the bee species therefore consistently using? And this one you're going to need a chemistry lab in the basement for. What is the nutritional makeup of the plant's pollen and nectar, not just protein, but sugars and amino acids? Critical stuff if you're a bee flying around, right? So can beauty go beyond flowers and plants and what they do for us alone? That's the ultimate question. Is beauty for one species enough to address climate change and mass extinction, to bridge human and wildlife cultures? Or is beauty for one privileged species another cause of climate change and mass extinction? One common argument is that nature is always changing and evolving. Therefore, gardens are natural extensions of that change as they manipulate nature. So it's okay to mix in exotic plants. But what this thinking ignores is that humans are supercharging change, forcing high-speed, do-or-die evolution by a sort of unnatural selection, privileging species, knowingly and not, based on aesthetics and desire over ecological function and habitat revival. We're not helping species evolve or adapt when we use plants they can't recognize. We're helping them vanish. We're not giving them the opportunity to adapt or evolve. We're saying we matter more than anyone else. So what is the great native plant conversation or debate then? Well, it's at once about reviving nature and understanding the science of plant and wildlife interactions. It's also, much more ominously, about realizing our culture and civilization is ending. It's about overcoming social myths of individual freedom and rights and progress. It's about the first steps in living a new life separate from the detrimental institutions and ideals we based our beliefs and livelihoods on. There really is no native plant debate. There is only the debate about human supremacy, genocide, and ecocide, and the cultural systems that support those realities, which we both actively and tacitly support, but could not imagine living without. How we process our grief as one world ends and another begins will prepare us for a radical future we might not survive. Now we need contact with nature, with daily wildness to stoke positive feelings towards others. And those others are birds, butterflies, bees, wasps, spiders, and even moles. And we need native plants that evolved to support those creatures in ways we don't even fully understand yet. When we have these positive interactions and experiences, a learning mechanism is triggered in our brains, which leads to empathy. And it only takes a very few engagements to make strong leaps in empathy-based thinking. This is why it's so important to get kids outside, right? So empathy starts with seeing and experiencing the world through another's circumstances, beliefs, and life experiences. That's already really hard for most of us, myself included. But we got to take it another step deeper. Compassion, on the other hand, is actually feeling, dealing with, accepting, and then taking action based on that other's existence. Gardens can teach us more than we ever dreamed of about fighting for lives marginalized in our own culture. And I always have to give folks some Thomas Martin. The whole idea of compassion is based on a keen awareness of the interdependence of all these living beings, which are all part of one another and all involved in one another. Now, such an act takes a great amount of courage and love and humility, because caring for others is a highly evolved way of caring for the self. And this is how our gardens need to change. Our gardens are places of social justice for all species, which in the end is social justice for ourselves. We need to move on to gardening 2.0, in other words. Now, native plants, I understand, can feel limiting and divisive because they confront our human privilege. No longer can gardens just be places for human desire, but in a time of extinction, they must be places of reconciliation ecology. Now, reconciliation ecology is the science of establishing new habitats to conserve species diversity in places where people live, work, and play. So think churches, schools, and obviously residential communities. How can we reconcile our culture with the culture of others in this space? Wow, that's a lot of lawn. How can we practice a social justice that lifts up all species, all cultures together? Well, we can go from this image and we can turn it into this image. It's the same hill. How can we transform even the smallest urban spaces? Because what the heck were people thinking? That one on the left is just, let's throw a couple plants down, rock, and probably a lot of pre-emergent herbicide under the mulch and call it, a very beautiful landscape, right? On the right, I know that image is a winter image, but you can just tell, but even with the plants cut back, there's not enough plants in here. This is outside a health clinic. Can you imagine what it'd be like to walk by the space when you're not feeling well and see dense, thick plantings of a rich diversity of flowers supporting all kinds of pollinators and birds? Just a little bit of Carex albicans, Geranium maculatum, Aquilegia canadensis, and Solidago flexicalis makes all the difference. This is a thin strip out of, it's outside of a, I guess a preschool, kindergarten, elementary school for disadvantaged youth, and they have a vegetable garden out here. So we're supporting pollinators right here with these native plants. They're gonna go give us some good green beans, tomatoes, and squash. Urban wildness is social justice for humans too, right? Students with views of complex nature out of classroom windows see a 7 to 26% increase in test scores and are more creative and able to focus and work in groups. Trees around schools and hospitals decrease airborne particulate matter within 100 feet by 25% that would otherwise harm the health of kids and patients. One mature tree with a 30-foot crown cools the air via transpiration by 2 to 9 degrees and cools shaded surfaces by 20 to 45 degrees. Now we're set to see a 2-degree rise in global temps by 2050. And that's going to also give us a 50% rise in violence because, people are generally not happy when they're hot. Urban areas with cultivated vegetation see significant drops in petty and violent crime, from mowed green spaces to community vegetable gardens, even to wilder landscapes with benches and walking paths. Thick gardens are not places for murderers to stalk their victims. They are places of birth and rebirth, peace and healing. Now here's Union Plaza here in Lincoln, Nebraska. This is actually a flood control zone. So if we get 6 inches of rain or something, this will be totally underwater and people will be canoeing underneath it. But a day or two later, the water will recede and all these native plant beds will come back and emerge again. We have so many urban parks all across the country, and they're often lawn dominated. Why can't you take a quarter acre or a half acre and throw down some seed? It makes a huge difference. Here's my friend Scott's garden out in Oregon. There's the hell strip on the left, so that thin 3-foot strip or so between the street and the sidewalk. So much you can do right there. Less lawn, right? We got to do something. We got to step up. Now's the time. So right now you guys are asking me, well, Benjamin, do we have any hope? And to that, we're going to look to Derek Jensen, environmental philosopher. He says hope is a longing for a future condition over which you have no agency. It means you are essentially powerless. So what do we say to ourselves? I hope we can save the bees. I hope more people will have less lawn. I hope mass extinction will end. Jensen says, a wonderful thing happens when you give up on hope. You cease relying on someone or something else to solve your problems. When you give up on hope, something even better happens than it not killing you, which is that in some sense it does kill you. And there's a wonderful thing about being dead, which is that those in power, cannot really touch you anymore. You come to realize that when hope died, the you who died with the hope was not you, but was the you who depended on those who exploit you, the you who believed that those who exploit you will somehow magically stop on their own. And who is left when that you dies? The you who thinks not what the culture taught you to think, but what you think. The you who feels not what the culture taught you to feel, but what you feel. When you give up on hope, you turn away from fear. When you quit relying on hope and instead begin to protect the people, things, and places you love, you become very dangerous indeed to those in power. Again, this is headquarters here in Nebraska. We have these subdivisions all over the country, and it's crazy, isn't it? Last happy slide for you. So we're going to go into the stretch run now, just a few slides left. Gardens can save the world by saving us. They can bring us back into contact with diversity. Gardens in our back and front yards, gardens along urban streets, gardens in suburban parks, gardens surrounding schools and churches and corporate headquarters, gardens buzzing and humming and rustling, forming connected highways of mammals and birds and pollinators and microbes. Gardens that heal our broken bonds to nature and to one another. Gardens as activism as surely as any art form and as surely as any mercy we might bestow on one another in times of sorrow. I want you guys to study and learn. Be open to perspectives and research that challenge and make you feel uncomfortable. Know that every plant and every place matters, a powerful, compassionate realization. Be willing to love with a broken heart, to foster that breaking and touch the world that so many hold at a distance to protect themselves. And understand that despair is a testament of your compassion and your willingness to fight for what you believe in, to be totally vulnerable to this awesome life. Sit outside on a summer evening and listen. Don't speak or move. Ride the sunset down past twilight into the dark starlight. Let your bones chill as crickets and lightning bugs rise from the shadows in their hunger. Every moment is an opportunity to wake from ourselves, but we must be as deliberate as crickets and lightning bugs in doing so. And when we are this deliberate, nothing can stop us from changing the world, not even our own fears. So who are we gardening for again? Queen butterflies, who by chance have no idea what was to the left of them, and neither did I until I brought the image in for processing. We're gardening for yellow shafted flickers. We're gardening for dragonflies atop liatris buds. We're gardening for tussock moths. Remember, milkweed is a host plant for so many species, not just monarchs. It's so many wonderful milkweed species out there. You have even more in Florida than I think I do. We're gardening for those looper moths, which have changed their camouflage to match the plant they're on now. We are gardening for native bees, of course. On the left is a carpenter bee who's drilled out the pith of a stem I left 12 inches tall in spring. And on the right is a mama bee in November who froze to death, defending the eggs behind her so predators wouldn't get to them, which is incredible devotion I hope I can show towards my own son someday. We are gardening for bees that give us attitude. We are gardening for flies that reflect us in their butts. So here's the last two slides. If you do want to get a tattoo of anything today, these would be the 2 slides for it. Your garden is a protest. It is a place of defiant compassion. That space is one to help you sustain wildlife and ecosystem function while providing an aesthetic response that moves you. For you, beauty isn't just pedal deep, it goes down into the soil, further down into the aquifer, and back up into the air and for miles around on the backs and legs of insects. You don't have to see soil microbes in action, birds eating seeds, butterflies laying eggs, ants farming aphids. Just knowing it's possible in your garden thrills you. It's like faith, and it frees you to live life more authentically. Your garden is a protest for all the ways in which we deny our life by denying other lives. So plant some natives and be defiantly compassionate. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope this has been an eye-opening and soul-opening talk for you, but let's have some Q&A now. Hopefully we have some good questions. I'll even turn on my video for you.
Oh, great, Benjamin. Let the people see you. That was brilliant, Benjamin.
Well, that's one.
It was everything I was hoping it would be. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Susan.
We got a couple of questions here. Oh, we have one person questioned. Let's see. On Long Island, New York, there are miles-long corridors of high-tension lines, at least 200 feet wide, that often transverse meadow-like areas that contain a number of wildflowers and sometimes also edged by woodland. Unfortunately, these meadowlands are often cut. While flowers are in mid-bloom and cut again before the plants go to seed. How do we otherwise identify invisible plant areas like this and then persuade the owners, like utility companies, to do their maintenance in harmony with the life cycle of plants and insects? Isn't that the question? You have anything you want to say about that?
No, that is the question. And that's a big deal. These power line cuts. I mean, yeah, we have lots of them, don't we? It's incredible. I mean, it's a miracle that we get some of these companies to plant prairie seed underneath them. I mean, they certainly do not need to be cut every year. I know the reason for the cutting is generally to reduce the amount of tree seedlings that are establishing, but trees aren't going to grow 20 or 50 feet in 1 year and threaten those power lines up above. So yeah,
I don't think it's only the tree seedlings they're worried about. I think often people, start to object to things not looking neat, right? And so your line, rethink pretty, is so critical. And how do we really instill that? I mean, there's 30 some odd people on this talk. How do they each instill that kind of new thought? I mean, that's the thing, is to re-educate how we see.
We got to start with examples. When we drive around any city in this country looks like any other city in this country, the way it's landscaped, the way it's manicured, right? We have to start taking a stand in landscapes. I have people all the time who say, yeah, I'm right behind you. Let's convert lawns to native plant gardens. But geez, what about the HOA or the weed ordinances? And I'm like, if you're not willing to step up and have some defiant compassion, lead the way and make a stand, what hope do any of us have collectively? So you got to start with what you have and where you are. That can be your home, that can be your church, your larger community.
Right. Another question came in from Julia. Can you talk more about how carbon dioxide affects nutrients in nectar and pollen?
I can't, because I'm not a scientist. I read other scientists and I quote them. Generally, what's going on is that carbon dioxide, the greenhouse effect, is making plants grow faster. So I certainly know, I'm more familiar with prairie plants out here, and we share a lot of the same species, so I'm not concerned about that conversation. But so as temperatures get warmer and there's more carbon in the air, the plants can grow faster and grow larger leaves. But when they're growing faster, their roots are not growing at the same rate, so they cannot supply as many of the nutrients as the leaves need. So essentially, nutrients are becoming diluted as those leaves grow so fast and grow so large. To know more, you'll have to read an actual expert on that.
Okay, well, thank you. So here's another question. Somebody says they can't hear me. Can you hear me now? I'm not muted, so you should be able to. But do you have a thought about how humans tend to step out in spring, look up, and seek to cut down? Is it our savanna origins? Have there been any studies about this? Perhaps Mary Pfeiffer has talked about this.
Yeah, there's lots of people who talked about this possible savanna origins, and I mean, we do have environmental genetic memory. I mean, we have memory of violence in us. You know, people who have been oppressed or abused, they pass along this memory in their genes to their children and even to their children's children and so forth. So yes, we have that memory genetically inside of us, and that could be it could be a lot of things beyond that too. It could just be our desire to have control just in general. To
Mm-hmm.
keep it could be trying to keep up with the Joneses. It could be, geez, it's a nice warm day and I got to do something.
What advice would you give to someone who's just starting to consider putting natives in their yard? What beginner advice do you have, Benjamin?
Well, there's so much beginner advice I could give someone. It really depends on how much you're willing to dive in and want to dive in and go for it. I mean, I sometimes tell people start small. I don't know if that's an issue. Other people, you know, after thinking about starting small, they think, gosh, why don't I just go all the way in so I have the space sooner? Because it takes 4 to 6 years for something landscape to establish. So, but just learning, reading. I mean, you're here right now listening to us talk here today. So that's a first big step. Just
I
read
read
as
so,
much as you can.
sorry, I read something on one of your columns that you said that you plant small, and I also try to plant as small as I can tolerate. And I like to encourage people to plant small. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because here in Palm Beach in particular, people want to see, they want to see a fully developed and ready garden, on the day that the diggers leave. So can you speak to that just a little bit, please?
So yeah, that's everybody wants a garden the next day, right? I always tell my clients, I give my clients an expectation sheet, and I say on that expectation sheet, it's going to be a couple of years, so patience is key. But when you say start small, do you mean start small as in plant size or in
Oh
garden
yeah, I
size?
start small in plant size. So if I
Yeah,
could put in a 3-gallon tree, I'd much rather do that than a
yeah.
25-gallon tree. But
No. It's better to use small plants because they establish so much faster in general. When you put a $400 tree in a 20-gallon container, those roots are going to be in shock a lot longer, and it's going to take a lot longer for it to establish than a tree in a 1-gallon container who doesn't have as many roots, and they can get out into the soil faster and all that good stuff. So, in my design practice, we do try to use 1 or 5-gallon trees and shrubs at most, and then plugs for the perennials and the grasses and the sedges.
yeah, that's great. I have another question that came in. Cynthia, hello. Joining you from Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada.
Oh, yay.
Yay, right? We're
Colder than
trying,
me.
colder than you. We're trying hard to garden ethically, but find that our antiquated municipal bylaws don't lend themselves to making these changes. Any recommendations on how to fight City Hall? Yes, fight City Hall, fight it with science, and find your community who can help you fight together. Look for your community because they're there. Benjamin, go ahead, speak to that.
Yeah, I've got a lot to speak to. Fortunately, some of it is behind a paywall, but I'll get to that in a second. So I have a blog post that's for free on my website, and it talks about the day when I just had it after being reported to my neighbors a couple of times, and I invited the weed superintendent, the big dog himself, to come out, and we had a kumbaya moment. And I learned a lot of things, and he learned a lot of things, and we came to a nice truce. Well, not even a truce. He seemed really energized and enthusiastic about what I was doing. But there's a lot of links there and a lot of helpful advice about how, there's things like cues to care, how your landscape looks, making it, look purposeful in your plant choice and in hardscapes that you use. But there are lots of legal victories across this country, and they're becoming more and more. I offer an online class that lists a lot of those and discusses a lot of those legal victories. I mean, there's one, I think it was Green Bay, where they've had some really, Green Bay, Wisconsin. So that's getting closer to Canada, where they've had some some good victories, and they've changed the law, they've changed the ordinances. Now, this is hard work, right? You are fighting an incredible wall. You're fighting decades of, well, this is just how it is. This is just, but laws can be changed, right? Human laws are infallible by definition. So none of this that we're talking about is easy. You have to be willing. You have to be willing to fight for it, because you have that passion and that love, and that sense of duty, not just for yourself, but for all the humans and other species around you. So it's not easy, and it's punishing. It's grueling. I'm sorry.
The other thing I would suggest, Cynthia, is I don't know what's happening in Canada, but here in the States there are native plant organizations. There's a Florida Native Plant Society. There's a National Native Plant Society. I don't know what there is in Canada, but I know that in Florida we have a model landscape ordinance that's available to people who want to start to craft that kind of legislation for their own municipalities. Here in Palm Beach, recently there's a new 35% law that mandates all new landscaping needs to have 35% of trees, 35% of shrubbery, 35% of ground covers, et cetera, that must be native. And there's definitely pushback, but that's what we need, and that's what we have to keep pushing forward. So
I mean,
applause to you.
Every great cultural change, societal change that we've had in our nation, and probably in all nations, has come through great struggle, right? But it's taken a small minority. It's something like just a few percentage points of people to change the needle drastically. And I think this is one of those inflection moments we're in.
That's that Margaret Mead quote, right? Never doubt that a small group of committed people can make something happen. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does. That was poorly paraphrased, but there it is, and she said it. Are there any other questions coming up? Anybody else? Thank you, David, for commenting on Pan's garden. Yes, we are making a difference here. Benjamin, I want to thank you just so graciously for being the headlight out there in the middle of the country. We need more of it. I have another comment that came in about people who are concerned about the liability from bees. Let me just say this: that was a backyard beekeeper, and then I noticed that the native bees in my almost all native garden were less and less, and my honeybees were more and more, and so I gave up my honeybees. And so my native bees are, restoring again. They do compete, but liability from bees, our native bees hardly sting. They hardly touch you. They don't care about you. It's the honeybees more. Go ahead.
Honeybees are aggressive. They want to defend their hive, right? Most of our native bees are solitary. They do not have a hive to defend. A lot of them don't even have stingers. If it's a female, they might even just use their ovipositor, that little sharp thing that lays eggs everywhere, and they might just prick you a little bit, but there's there's nothing bad going on. Unless you go and actually grab a honeybee, a bee, any bee, and cup it in your hand, you're okay. And it might even be a male bee who doesn't have a stinger. So the liability is so infinitesimal. I would think having honeybees would be a far larger issue.
Absolutely, and the bees that will sting you in your native garden will more than likely be honeybees.
And bees just want to eat. They want to be left alone and eat. So do that. Appreciate them from 6 inches away.
I do have one more question in terms of planting small. If you have limited room, it may be better to plant a group of 5 plus 1 native plant species. What does that mean? A group of 5 plus 1 native plant species, so as to be visible and attractive to birds and insects. Plant natives. Don't worry about it. Just plant natives. Plant 6 natives. You're good.
If you have a smaller space too, I think it's important. This is where design comes in, and some people argue about this, but if you have a smaller space, keep that design simple and legible and clean. And for me, that means less diversity of species, so it looks less messy, but also keeping things at a relatively short height, or most plants are at the same height. Just it shows that tidiness, but you're still providing way more ecosystem services than if you used a bunch of hosta or daylily or had lawn.
Great. Great. Well, I think now we're really done. So
Okay.
Benjamin, thank you. God bless. And
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to speak with you all today.
great to speak to you also. So there's his website, y'all, and log on and get a signed copy of his book. So we'll see you another time.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.